the scope of 9/11 conspiracies is huge, too wide. There are volumes and volumes of books on every aspect. The government involvement, lack of involvement, NORAD's downs, who the terrorists were, what they weren't, misinformation, disinformation within both sides, competing theories. It's a lot. Where I started in this was really focusing on the collapses of the buildings. And some people think that's not even an area worth focusing on because there's more damning circumstantial evidence, or, it takes away from, the issues of the more commonly accepted issues of preemptive warfare strategies, the Wolfowitz Doctrine, etc., Patriot Act. These are the things we should focus on. Fine, you can believe in that. But for whatever reason, I'm just fixated on the collapse theories of the World Trade Center. And I want to make the case in this video that even if, excuse me, I'm not saying this right. I stayed up way too late putting this together. You're not crazy for believing either side because it is so complex and it's so outside of the area of expertise of so many people that you can actually be a rational, independent investigator and really come on either side. And with the advent of AI, there's some additional tools at your disposal here to filter out disinformation, try to put together good information. And, with the AI tools also, there's a susceptibility of them just feeding you what you want to hear. So what I'm going to do here is show you what I've encountered up to this point and why I find it compelling. So here, just briefly, just some reputable resources, as reputable as any human resources could be on such a complex topic. Architects and Engineers, 3,500 professional strong, Lawyers Committee, Richard Gage as an individual. There's an International Center for 9/11 Truth and Justice that puts together a lot of useful resources. And this tried and true website that's been around since forever. It's a great Wikipedia-style method of investigating pretty much everything, and it disavows itself from junk science and no jetliner claims. And then here's a couple others, Firefighters for 9/11 Truth, because there's those angles of investigation as well into the building failures, which firefighters are particularly interested in and educated on. So what I'm going to explain here, and I'll try to go chronologically, is that, officially the initiation of the collapse of the towers was due to unprecedented fire conditions following a high-speed aircraft strike, not a design error. That's something that a lot of people, lay people, when just discussing amongst themselves think, oh, well, they designed it a certain way and they're particularly vulnerable. It wasn't due to the flawed design. So no matter what, whether it was the planes themselves and the collapse with gravity or the conspiracy angle, it was due to a chain of unprecedented high energy events. Everybody agrees on that. What remains unsettled is not why the collapse began necessarily, but how and why it progressed so rapidly, symmetrically, and completely without visible resistance or deceleration across such a large and complex structure. Now, I'm not a physicist and I'm not an engineer. And having this discussion amongst other people that aren't professionals is really tricky because we're so out of our depth. And so the default is to lean on authority, which is totally rational. And some things that are complex like this can seem unintuitive. But, physics doesn't care about our intuitions. Physics only cares about facts, evidence, reality. And experts should be trusted because they are in the know. And even despite knowing this, I'm going to make the case that it's not the expert consensus that we think. So just to circle back a little bit, it's good to stick with public record, mainstream sources. It's good to honor and respect the victims. This isn't about, there's this horrible person named Judy Wood who is a very obnoxious and loud person in the 9/11 truth movement who promotes a lot of junk science and is disrespectful to the victims. And because she is so outspoken and well known, people who have any alternative to the official explanation kind of get lumped in with that extremely distasteful type of flavor of conspiracy. And that's not what I'm doing this for. And it was in the interest of the victims' families. They want to know why the buildings failed. And this is an interest irrespective of what we end up finding as the cause, because it's one thing to just say, oh, the airplanes hit it, so of course. Well, not necessarily of course. There's a lot of kind of nerdy but actually legitimate investigation into why they failed the way they did, just as explained before. Because if there's a way that, maybe the collapse could have been arrested if it was designed a different way. These are things worth exploring because we have lots of other skyscrapers. Or make the, fireproofing, better somehow, some way, if whatever the cause is, it's worth exploring. So let's start from the beginning. 2 days after 9/11. There's this professor, he's an expert. So he wrote a paper, a full paper, peer-reviewed paper on his mathematical theory of the progression of the collapse. Now, the reason why this is so important is because he's literally the only one that studied or even has a theory on the collapse progression. But because he put this out so early, every other subsequent investigation, which really focused on the initiation of the collapse, rested on his mathematical proofs. Oh, well, he said that collapse was inevitable once it started. And here's this peer-reviewed proof, so we don't have to investigate it anymore. But as you can see, there's a lot of problems. He calls the upper block that falls onto the lower structure Part C. And here's a list of all the different ways that his model element analysis differs from the real world empirical features. As you could, there's a lot here. And just for a visual representation, here's his, where he assumes a crush down phase and a crush up phase, really oversimplifying the structure so that he can make the math work. Dismissing lateral ejection of debris, dismissing the standing core. So there's still a question mark here, is what I'm saying. It's not sufficient. Now, in 2001 and early 2002, there were some early progressive collapse hypotheses using the surviving debris. So this journal and FEMA had a trust failure theory, which actually turned out to not be true. This insurance study for the owner of the World Trade Center complex was making the case that the structure itself, design-wise, couldn't be a reason for the failure, that it really was due to the extreme events that triggered the collapse. And their theory was a column failure. And this was actually not released publicly until 2010. So nobody knew the details of this study for almost 10 years. What we did get, as mandated federally, was National Institute of Standards and Technology reports. So in 2005, we got one on the towers, and in 2008, we got one on Building 7. Now, Building 7 is still like the hot button one because we don't have really the input data on their computer models of the collapse, because they attempted physical models for collapse initiation and they didn't really materialize. So they resorted to computer models to make the collapse work. And the scope of this did not include collapse progression. This is just limited to collapse analysis or collapse initiation. So meaning they said they were done as soon as they saw any movement, structural movement failure. They didn't study anything beyond that. Well, the problem with that is that all the anomalous issues happen in the dynamics of the collapse, not the initiation. It's not that hard to think that a plane impact could cause some structural failure. That's not the issue that conspiracy people bring up. Conspiracy people are saying everything about how it collapsed so rapidly, so completely. That's the problem. And no one has done any experiment showing that this is physically possible. And even Bazant's mathematical analysis showing that it is possible in, spherical chickens in a vacuum hypotheticals, hasn't been replicated or demonstrated. And, this was mid-2000s. It's 2025 now. People have access to computers that can do these type of soft body physics, and no one's still done it. So to further make my case here, what do the studies prove? What they ignore, the collapse progression. It neither validates whether the upper mass stays coherent long enough to transfer momentum. We saw it breaking apart as it crushes down. They don't analyze whether the collapse dynamics match the acceleration, symmetry, and pulverization seen in the video footage. Neither engages with alternative collapse mechanisms like unconventional materials or engineered demolition. There's lots of the anomalies that they need to explain are the missing jolt, meaning in other even controlled demolitions, if you start blowing things up in the middle, when the top part hits the bottom, it doesn't keep accelerating through. There's a slowdown. It wasn't observed. Symmetrical disintegration, despite asymmetrical damage. The plane didn't hit every single column perfectly. It hit some more than others. So what we should expect to see is, a tilting or a falling off, or, and we do see initial tilting, but then it immediately rapidly destroys the whole building. Also, lateral ejection. If you see other controlled demolitions or, just top-down, even just accidental disasters, the debris doesn't shoot out the way it does. There was lots of very heavy, multi-ton components that were shot out over 600 feet horizontally. And there's also, when there's like earthquake disasters and the buildings fall down, or even fire disasters, like the one, I think there was one in Florida where there was like water damage. There was a stack pile of the floors because it accumulated and it fell. Of course, the commission and Pentabomb, they didn't even like mention any of this. They were focused on who the terrorists were, supposedly, what the evidence was for that or lack of evidence, making sure that nobody was punished for their failures to protect us and all the intelligence failures. Instead, we got rewarded. But that's not the scope of this video here. What they also ignored, besides most of the evidence getting destroyed, and blueprints not being publicly available, were actually leaked in March 2007. So, people were hamstrung to figure this out for themselves. In 2009, active thermitic material was discovered. So what's thermitic material? So thermite is an incendiary. It's a chemical mixture that, once ignited, can melt steel. Nanothermite, it was patented in 1996 for use in demolition of buildings without all the high decimal noise. And a byproduct of using that is iron-rich microspheres, which was found in all the World Trade Center dust by multiple independent, not just conspiracy people. Everybody agrees there are a preponderance of iron-rich microspheres, which can only be formed when the metal's molten and isn't in any other debris or dust from any other sources in the amount that we find in the World Trade Center dust. NASA thermal hotspots and Raytheon Airborne found all these like crazy heat signatures only in World Trade Center 1, 2, and 7, not in any of the other buildings. We have lots of testimony of the molten metal, as you can see, molten metal falling here. This is during the cleanup at Ground Zero. Now, what NIST should have done was test the physical samples they had for explosive residues or evidence of this. What they did instead was, which was a dick move, was they said they found no corroborating evidence to suggest that explosives were used. But then they were forced to admit that they didn't test for any presence of the explosive residue. So in other words, they're like, well, there isn't any. How do you know? Well, we didn't look for it. And as you can see, there's this paper, this peer-reviewed scientific paper on this nanothermite. They ignited it, so they know it works. They ignited what was unignited, and then they found partially ignited. So it had been happening, and this hasn't been debunked. It hasn't been replicated either, but it hasn't been debunked. They're the two main arguments against it, which we'll go over in another slide, is they're not thermite, it's paint chips. Yeah, but those claims don't explain the explosiveness, and that was not a peer review. And then the other one was, well, there's a chain of custody issue. How do we know we found this in the dust? Which I would respond, okay, so these people who lost their professional reputation put together all this evidence, that there's nanothermite, so that to convince who and for what benefit. And it's like they made it themselves. Like, it doesn't make any sense. Also, as we talked about FEMA's report, which had the very cartoonish and not agreed upon collapse hypothesis, they did actually find evidence of evaporated steel. So here's a picture of it. They said it was the greatest mystery. They had no idea how the hell this happened. It's pretty easy to explain if you know that there was thermite involved or if you hypothesize that. All right. You're thinking to yourself right now, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. He's cherry picking so-called evidence. I'm sure there's an expert somewhere that would just immediately dismiss all this. If this was all true, we would have, professional organizations saying, oh, look at this. And, the fact that's not followed up upon immediately spreads doubt onto this. This is just conspiracy gobbledygook. Fine. LLMs, large language models, AI, is a great research tool. There was a study conducted in 2024, September 2024, that interactions in LLMs reduced belief in conspiracy theories by an average of 20%, with 1 in 4 participants disavowing conspiracies entirely. The AI's effectiveness stems from its ability to provide detailed evidence-based rebuttals directly addressing participants' claims. The AI maintained high accuracy with 99.2% of its claims rated as true by professional fact checkers. So, you know what? Let's put all this conspiracy shit to the test, right? So one of the first things I asked it was, is there really a genuine scientific consensus on the collapse of the World Trade Center? Because what I'm seeing is all the professional analysis stopping their investigation as soon as the collapse begins, and then leaning on Bazant's math to assume that the collapse progressed, even though that model was overly simplified. And what I got is, well, is it independent analysis for the World Trade Center case here? No, it relies heavily on institutional authority. Is there open debate and critique? No, there's evidence of gatekeeping from ASCE and other journals, which there is. I should have included it in here, but there is. Empirical validation, direct experimental or modeling validation, nope. Lack of detailed collapse progression modeling. Risk for disagreement, yes. There's high social and professional cost for skepticism in this area. So let's see how it really, what the LLMs say about this. Hypothesis A, we'll call it gravitational overload due to the fire and plane debris or plane damage. And then hypothesis B is artificial removal, meaning artificial removal of the structure below to allow for these collapse characteristics. So we're using GPT 4.5 and Claude 3.7. These are the frontier AI models. We're comparing the official versus alternative explanations here. So on the top is GPT 4.5. So here we have these observable phenomenon, which are these anomalies, right? Rapid initiation and progression. Does it fit with gravitational overload? Partially. Does it fit with artificial removal? Very well. Vertical symmetry? Well, it's a difficult fit. Whereas artificial removal, it's a very strong fit. What about the lack of deceleration or missing jolt? This is a poor fit for gravitational overload and a very strong fit for artificial removal. High-speed lateral ejection, it's a difficult fit. Whereas artificial removal, a strong fit. Massive debris distribution, once they finished collapsing, 80% of the debris was outside the footprint. This is a poor fit for gravity-driven crushing, but a strong fit for explosives or rapid, removal. Absence of a floor stack, a pancaking effect at the bottom. This is a difficult fit with gravitational, but a strong fit for fragmentation from energetic structural removal. Persistent heat in molten metal. This is a poor fit for the gravity-driven collapse from fire. But a moderate or strong fit for thermetic or explosive energetic methods. What about the complete structural failure and pulverization, meaning instead of partial? Well, this is a difficult fit, but for gravity-driven, but a strong fit for artificial removal. I did the same question with Claude 3.7, and they went over the same observable phenomenons, almost the same. And here we have gravity versus artificial. It's all strong on the artificial and partial and weak or poor or difficult on gravity. Now, I'm like, okay, well, what about Wikipedia? People love going to Wikipedia to debunk all this shit. All right, well, we have claims for free fall acceleration of World Trade Center 7. Was this addressed by Wikipedia? Yes, because NIST was forced to admit it by a conspiracy guy. Well, what's the strength of Wikipedia's rebuttal? Moderate, not fully satisfactory. So what about the missing jolt? Well, Bazant tried addressing it. He addressed it indirectly with his mathematical models instead of any experiments. It's weak because it's highly theoretical. What about pulverization or lateral ejection? Well, they say it's compressed air. It's an incomplete explanation. What about the iron-rich microspheres from the thermite? There's no clear rebuttal. It's very weak. There's no official explanation. So what about the nanothermite that was found? Well, it has to be acknowledged, just like the free fall of WTC 7. What's the strength of Wikipedia's rebuttal? Well, it's mixed. There's a strong chain of custody critique, but no weak or no chemical rebuttal. Now, here we go to the physics again. I'm not a physicist. I think the physics doesn't make sense, but I'm not a physicist, so what the hell am I even talking about? I'm talking way out of my depth here. Well, let's lean on the LLMs, shall we? Structural dynamics, what's not adding up? Multiple domains of physics. So I asked what adds up and doesn't add up. And as you can see listed here, a lot of things don't add up. Continuum mechanics, impulse transfer, collapse propagation, energy distribution. I just included this here because it's a little hard to see, but this is a piece that's falling through the air, right? And if you look closely, this is not a shadow. This is actually the back end of the building blowing up. And so the reason why this is included is because this is sort of demonstrating that the rubble falls just as fast whether falling inside or outside the tower. it all happened so fast and so much of it was obscured by smoke. Nobody could really pay attention to this. The more you look into this, the more you'll see that this collapse is exploding apart, not being crushed down. Now, this is where lay people like me say the wrong things when trying to explain why the physics doesn't work. So, one of these people got debunked because he tripped on a technicality of Newton's third law. He was trying to make the case that, if the upper block is striking the bottom block, they're going to crush each other at the same rate. He's trying to make that point that it's Newton's third law. But he said that instead of using the technical term transfer impulse. So the upper block appears to disintegrate before it could transfer impulse, which you could see for yourself in the footage. Now, I want to say it looks like a controlled demolition. What I should say is collapse characteristics remain empirically unreplicated in similar structures, which is exactly my point. I want to say the physics was violated. What I should say, to be technical, is the observed dynamics challenge current simplified modeling assumptions. They do, because they don't match. I want to say the government lied. But what really happened was there may be premature closure in the absence of empirical validation. So it's essentially saying the same thing, but not getting lawyered into, haha, you're wrong because you said this wrong word. The spirit of the argument remains. Now, okay, I asked the LLM, are there any issues with the molten metal or nanothermite evidence here? Okay, so topic, thermite or nanothermite, what's vulnerable? The chain of custody? Well, what should I do instead? Focus on the iron microspheres, which remained unexplained empirically. Fine. It's right next to it. And, this is really just to, fight those people that really want to argue about it without really being sincere. But still, the truth can defend itself. Molten metal, NIST says it's likely aluminum, weak but plausible. So instead, focus on the persistent extreme heat rather than molten steel. So in other words, that persistent extreme heat, which was confirmed by the NASA satellites and everything, is just as impossible as molten steel and is essentially the same thing. But in an argument, you could focus on that. What about the World Trade Center 7 symmetry of its collapse? So NIST claims thermal expansion and global instability. Yeah, but still, what initiated the perfect free fall for 2.25 seconds? That is unexplained, no matter whether it's symmetrical or not. It just does not make sense. Fireproofing dislodged, NIST used it to justify collapse initiation. So, fine, don't contest it, even though it's contestable. Focus on, instead, whether or not the collapse propagation actually follows. Fine, let's do the paint chip rebuttal that doesn't work. So nanothermite versus paint chips in this paper. So which on the criterion here explains energetic ignition and microsphere formation? Nanothermite's a clear explanation. Paint chip, nope. Matches the dust evidence, clear match. Paint chip, nope. Chain of custody, fine. Valid critique. Motivation to falsify findings, little or no credible motivation. Paint chip, especially not applicable. Independent replication or refutation, none yet in peer review. Period. So, what about other issues with the official rebuttal points? So, there's a type of demolition called vernissage. I don't know how to pronounce that French word, but essentially, unlike other demolitions that start at the bottom, which is what we're used to seeing here in the U.S., they actually purposefully start with the middle floors and let the top portion collapse onto the bottom and then crush symmetrically like that. All of those videos, if you look it up, you can Google any of them, they show observable deceleration, aka the missing jolt that we don't see on the World Trade Center. There's a counterpoint of the implausibility of setting up explosives, Well, with the FEMA reported corrosion, existence of the nanothermite, this can be quiet, unnoticed weakening methods. There's strong documented evidence and reasoning for this. Thermite itself lacks the explosive power. I mean, we're talking about the lateral ejection, so where's the explosives? Well, Jonathan E. Cole, who's a great scientist and made lots of videos on his channel, Physics and Reason, did replicatable experiments showing thermitic cutting and explosive effects, both that are feasible and demonstrated. This is the LLM trying to fact check me here. Now, let's do even more common rebuttals. So, did I just do a... Yeah, this is a duplicate here. I already went over this point here. So let's go down to this part. Now, this gets into much more speculative territory, but it's worth pointing out before we go over back to the physics again. Now, how could this have gone unnoticed? It doesn't make any sense to have like thousands of professionals go in there and rig it. Well, this can function as a springboard for you to go deeper. I'm not going to go too much, but this is how the LLM rates the speculative credibility of these. So means and opportunity. So for Stratosec or Securicom, means they were in charge of security and electronic systems. They had high-level ongoing access at the World Trade Center, so moderate. What about Ace Elevator? There were extensive renovations pre-9/11, actually the biggest elevator renovations in history. And they weren't the typical vendor. They had elevator shaft direct access. This is high. Marvin Bush and Barry McDaniel, they had connections to the security firm, high-level insider status and access, moderate. I mean, we're just doing speculation here. L. Paul Bremer, in relation to the demolition, maybe not necessarily related to other things. They had presence in the impacted companies, unusual media availability on 9/11. This is just circumstantial. Now, here's where we get to these two high ones. Fireproofing upgrades in the impact zones a year prior. Direct core column access, precise impact zones pre-9/11. This is the LLM trying to... I mean, it will tell me if it doesn't work, if it's not credible. Ace Elevator upgrades, direct vertical shaft access with extensive elevator renovations. So this is all... I mean, the LLMs have access to all the information online, and this can include disinformation as well as valid information. And so this shouldn't be taken as proof, but I do want to circle back to what this study on LLMs reducing belief in conspiracy theories would show. So this is contradicting what we would expect if these were actually false. And the last thing I'm going to show here is a summary that Claude put together for me last night. It's a comparative analysis of how different hypotheses account for this observed phenomena. So the hypothesis A, I mean, we saw this already here briefly, but this is a very truncated. Let me try to find this again. It's really... Each slide has these observables that are an issue. So for each point, instead of just having one little comment here, it goes into more detail. So for the rapid collapse initiation and progression and the gravity driven, what does it explain? What does it not? So the check mark probably should be green and make it a little easier on the eyes. If there's a flag here, it's weak. If it's a check mark, it's strong. And then if it's an X, it means it really doesn't match. So for the purposes of this video, I'm just going to show the check marks and the warning signs for each. So gravity driven, we got one check mark, 2 warnings. Artificial removal, we got all 3. For this observable symmetric collapse pattern, we have all warnings here on the gravity driven and all check marks on the artificial. The missing jolt, it actually, we have an X here on the gravity driven and 2 warnings and all 3 check marks in artificial. High energy debris ejection, all warnings on the gravity driven and all check marks on the artificial. And you can pause this video at any point if you want to read further. Pulverization, same thing. Gravity driven, all warnings. Artificial removal, all check marks. And this was only after a couple prompts. I just put in some of my previous chats from GPT 4.5, fed them into the project function of Claude 3.7, and this was it said that it wanted to spit out this output essentially for me as a summary. The debris distribution, hypothesis A, all warnings. So warnings, I mean, it's still possible, but it's not as good of a fit. Artificial removal, all check marks. Post-collapse thermal anomalies. There we have an X here on the gravity-driven, and then we have all check marks on the artificial. World Trade Center 7, we have an X once again in the gravity-driven with 2 warnings, and then all check marks on the artificial. Yeah, and so as you can see, we've already went through the summary matrix. Scientific validation status. So for the gravity-driven, no scaled physical model has reproduced the observed collapse characteristics or demonstrates the full progression with observed features. The official modeling stopped at collapse initiation, and Bazant's used simplified assumptions, don't capture observed phenomena. So artificial removal, known demolition precedents exhibit similar collapse characteristics. No detailed model of exactly how this would have been implemented, though. And research is limited by institutional barriers. So, that's all I wanted to show for today, and hopefully this was interesting and may spur further conversation. Thank you for listening.